and start the recording. So we're welcoming today Stephanie, and I'll go ahead and I'm actually just going to turn it over to Stephanie and let her introduce herself. She's got an introduction slide here, and so I'm just going to say thank you, Stephanie, for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. So everybody can see my presentation. Are we good? Awesome. Okay. All right. So my name is Stephanie Ockerman, and I run an agility training and enablement business called Agile Socks. And in addition to facilitating powerful exercise-driven learning in the form of professional Scrum training, I am passionate about creating accessible online learning and powerful transformation experiences that go beyond Scrum to help Scrum Masters fully unleash their unique leadership power, finding more confidence and ease, and creating the impact we want to have. And the reason that this talk is important to me is because I feel like I have spent a lot of my life being sucked into the culture of goal setting and achievement. And I'm not saying goals and wanting to achieve things is inherently bad, but the way it's often done in companies and even how we've been socialized to do it in our personal lives can be a bit toxic. And it often works against us, taking focus away from the things that truly matter and preventing us from taking advantage of new opportunities. And this is why I've been a proponent of Scrum.org's evidence-based management framework, EBM, for years. It gives companies tangible guidance on how to break out of those unhelpful and potentially even toxic patterns in how they use goals and measures. And EBM addresses how to leverage goals, measures, and empiricism effectively to continuously improve customer outcomes, organizational capabilities, and business results. So just to give you a little bit of that background, this talk will bring some components of EBM to life. And if it resonates, I encourage you to read the EBM guide on Scrum.org's website. If you've read my blog posts or you subscribe to my newsletter, you know that I tend to think about things holistically. I like to talk about agility in product and work-oriented ways, but also how it shows up in other aspects of our lives. So I will be doing that here because agility is about navigating complexity and unpredictability, and that describes so much of life, right? So the more opportunities we have to practice agility, the more it will become naturally ingrained in our thinking and our normal approach, like just how we show up every day. And so we do value goal setting in our society, right? We think it's a sign of being driven, hardworking, and productive. And I'm a planner by nature. I'm organized, I like goals, and goals can be super helpful if we use them effectively and have a healthy relationship with goals. So what I want to do is give you 60 seconds, take 60 seconds, grab, a sticky note and a pen, or if digital is your tool of choice, to just write down all the goals that impact you. So thinking about personal goals, maybe it's a health or lifestyle related thing, an experience or a thing that you're wanting. Consider individual goals you might have in your job, goals that are related to your team, maybe at work, or we're often part of other teams. Consider organizational goals that impact you. All right, so take 60 seconds, write them down. All right. You might still be writing. That's okay. Finish your thoughts. The first thing I want to get curious about is how many goals did you write down? So if you're comfortable sharing in the Zoom chat window, just quickly count the number of goals that you wrote down and drop that in the Zoom chat. All right. Definitely seeing a theme that we're more than one or two, even upwards of 5, 6, 7. Yeah. Yeah. So we're familiar
Can
with this.
everybody see? I'm sorry, Stephanie. I've had a couple people say they couldn't see your screen share. I can see it.
Okay.
Is there anybody else who can't see it, or can you guys see it? The thumbs up, the ones who are on video, can you see it? Okay, all right. I'm not sure. It must be related to an individual.
Random troubleshooting of our virtual tools. It's always fun, right? All right. Well, hopefully this is being recorded. So if you can't see, and also my visuals are not like super detailed. They're more like to help people follow along. So you're not going to be missing out on too much if you can't see the presentation, just FYI. It's more like the visual aid to kind of anchor us as we go through it. So you'll have access after this as well through the recording. All right. Okay. So I like to make things as relatable as possible for people's context, but also as actionable as possible. So as I take you through each of the common mistakes, the 4 common mistakes that we make with goals, you are going to be able to kind of take note of what you wrote down and just start to jot down, like, where do you see any of those mistakes showing up? Maybe even just a little bit, right? And then I will share some tips towards the end on how to fix your goals or influence changing goals that may not be yours to set alone, so that they are useful rather than maybe oppressive or taking us out of alignment with what's important. And then I'm going to save questions for the end. So I'm going to try to save a good 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. All right. And then also I have a special offer for Scrum Masters of the Universe members who do want to go deeper and join me for a 1-day live virtual evidence-based management workshop in May. So I'll share more details with you about that at the end as well. Okay. All right. So first mistake number 1. Goals are not focused on customer outcomes. So instead of focusing on customer outcomes, goals may be too focused on activities and outputs. Okay. And so let me give you an example of an output focused goal. So a product team may have a goal focused on delivering a specific feature set to customers. However, there's no guarantee that that feature set will actually improve the customer's experience. And how we deliver that feature set, the decisions that we make along the way about what exactly we build and how we build it, what will that be guided by, right? It might be guided by initial research we've done, but what if things evolve and change as we go? And so if we focus the goal on what outcomes we want to create for the customer, then we now have a goal that doesn't just put us in the mode of cranking out the work, but making sure that what we do is aligned with customer value, which might need to change or evolve over time. So let me give you an example of an activity-focused goal. There might be a recruiting team that has a goal focused on the number of interviews they schedule. However, if they're not quality candidates and we're really just trying to get that number up, right, or meet a certain threshold of the number of interviews that are scheduled, the experience is likely to be poor for everyone involved and not actually meet, right, what is probably the underlying goal, right, of filling positions with the right candidates, or even creating connections with potential candidates for the future, and so things that are more in that customer outcome realm. All right, so now let's look at a personal example. If we set personal goals related to things like reaching a specific salary, which that's really an output focused goal. How could that lead us astray and negatively impact us? Well, you may have been there before. I know I've been there before. So we might start making decisions to take a new job solely because it offers the highest salary, even though it doesn't fulfill us, or maybe offer other benefits that are important to us. And it may even make us miserable, right? That's a possibility. And so we might find ourselves also continuing to raise that bar, like kind of looking at that as the level, like the achievement, kind of that achievement driven thing. And so if we keep raising that bar, right, and we start looking at salary as like it means something about us, it means we're successful as a scrum master or whatever that role is, right? And then our worthiness sort of gets wrapped up in that too. And that's a little bit of what I mean by like that achievement driven culture, that kind of the toxicity that can come up there. Now, don't get me wrong, I like money. I want to get paid what I'm worth, but I have worked to reframe monetary goals instead as desires or targets that provide context in my situation, but not the goal in itself. Okay. So next up, mistake number 2, we don't measure what matters. So let's take a step back and remind ourselves of the purpose of measuring, okay? Measures are essentially the transparent information that helps us understand progress and guides our decisions, essentially supporting effective inspection and adaptation. And remember that what you measure will influence behavior. Often I see organizations measuring activities and outputs, but missing outcomes. And the number of hours worked or the percent of budget burned, right? Those are measuring activities, does not tell you how much value you're delivering. It doesn't tell you anything about your progress towards value, your ability to deliver value in the future. And so that focus on measuring activities isn't going to be useful in guiding our decisions. And it doesn't even help us really understand, that progress toward a goal. And even if we have measures like that seem kind of on the surface value driven, like number of customer orders filled, or sometimes things like number of features delivered, velocity, throughput, right? Or other terms you'll see for that. Those don't tell you much about the customer experience. And so that focus on measuring outputs doesn't give us the feedback we need to guide us. All right. We also need to remember that having multiple measures is going to give us a better idea of what is happening. Because when we're doing complex work in complex and unpredictable environments, one measure doesn't often give us enough perspectives to understand what's really happening and how we may want to adapt. So for example, we may use NPS or Net Promoter Score or something similar to understand customer satisfaction. This is a great thing to know. But if we have no other measures about how customers are using our product and service, right, then it will be difficult to know what may be impacting changes in NPS or a lack of change in NPS, right? Like we're putting out new capabilities or features or functions. And it's like, which of those are having an impact? What's not having an impact, right? Like needing more perspectives to understand what's happening. And of course, we're also influenced by factors that we can't really control too, things that are happening in our environment. So, I mean, it could be that you're greatly impacted by stock market fluctuations, supply chain issues, right? Lots of different things could impact people. So it's like having multiple measures can also help us start to recognize when like, wait, we think this thing that's kind of out of our control might be impacting this too, right? And then we can bring that information in as part of, trying to do the best we can with the knowledge that we have. Right. So just creating greater transparency to have a wider perspective and try to understand what's really going on. So let me share another example that I see a lot with individuals. Have you ever felt the pressure to get more certifications and read every book written about agility ever? Yeah. So, I mean, I have, right? been there. And I still find myself in that, like, oh, I got this stack of books, I need to read them. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with learning and growing and earning certifications to validate our learning. I mean, I teach courses that help people earn certifications for a living. I wrote a book that I would like people to read, you know? So, however, if we're only measuring the number of certifications we earn and the number of books we read, we might be losing sight of why we're doing it to begin with. And then we might just end up going through the motions, rushing through that experience without intentionally applying the learning, right? And then we haven't really gained much benefit from the time and effort we put into the process, right? So thinking of like, how do I intentionally apply what I'm learning? And some of this will be based on learning styles, right? I'm a very slow reader when it comes to professional type books, especially because it's like, I know that to process it and to retain any of that knowledge, I need to be really intentional. And I often will like highlight, I'll take notes and kind of create myself like a little kind of a one pager kind of cheat sheet of like the key things that I learned, but also taking time to intentionally practice the learning, right? So whether I'm reading a book, whether I'm taking a class, you know, whatever that is, it's like, I want to gain a benefit of being, you know, better at what I do or growing a skill set that's going to have some impact on others, right? And on me, right? Likely bringing maybe me deeper fulfillment, bringing me more ease, bringing me more confidence, you know, those types of things. All right. All right. So let's move to mistake number 3. Mistake number 3, we don't inspect and adapt our goals frequently enough or at all. So this was actually a huge aha for me. It was like, wait, we can change our goals? What? Yeah, goals are not supposed to be fixed and unchanging. Remember that goals are based on assumptions. This means we should be validating our goals frequently, right? We're dealing with complexity and ambiguity, right? Like, why would we think that the goals would be fixed? Well, we do because, you know, we see that around us. We've been socialized to do it in that way, right? In a lot of cases. And so we should be asking ourselves questions like, is this still the right thing to focus on? What have I learned that helps me clarify this goal? Right? And so, you know, consider that list of goals that you just made, right? Are they open to change as you're learning more, or are they being treated as fixed? Now, of course, the pandemic provides a very powerful example that many of us can relate to in a number of ways when it comes to needing to change course with our goals, both at an organizational level and a team level, but I would say also probably even in our personal lives. And so, but I do want to point out that it shouldn't take a world-changing and hugely disruptive event to trigger us to look at our goals, clarify them based on what we're learning, or even change them. Okay. An example that I run into all the time is what I call the dreaded annual portfolio planning cycle. Anybody familiar with this concept? So what I'll typically see is like, you know, maybe sometime in the late third quarter, sometimes even earlier than that, organizations start having all of their leaders come up with the list of initiatives they're going to do next year, right? We got to put together high level budgets and schedules. We got to do the capacity planning. And these leaders, of course, go to their teams and ask them to create high level plans and estimates. And I've seen this activity consume massive amounts of people's time, lasting a month or even 4 months, even longer. And it tends to be really stressful because, well, it's pretty damn hard to predict the future and plan a year's worth of work, right? So this plan is often then used to create fixed goals for individuals and departments for the next year, right? And ultimately, it's creating a lot of waste because the detailed plan is often useless just a couple months into the next year. And, you know, we're doing our best. We're still trying to meet these fixed goals. And when people's goals are fixed for the year, that actually encourages them to set goals that are based on things they think they have a better chance of controlling, right? Like activities and outputs instead of customer outcomes. Okay. So this leads us to defining solutions up front, creating estimates based on those solutions. And we not only lose sight of customer outcomes, but this also is shutting down creativity and innovation, right? When we're kind of predefining these solutions up front. And so in evidence-based management, in EBM, the concept of the experiment loop is introduced as a way to recognize that we make progress towards goals in a series of small experiments. And then based on the results of those experiments, we must decide whether we stop, keep going, or pivot. And this includes possibly refining, updating, or even changing the goal. Yeah. All right. So next up, mistake number 4. We focus too much on the practices for creating and aligning goals. So similar to what I teach with Scrum, both in my training, what I write about all the time, on like LinkedIn or in my newsletter, is that there are no best practices in Scrum and really in any other complex or unpredictable work, right? We're dealing with complexity, ambiguity, rapid change. There cannot be best practices when it comes to goals in a complex environment. And so what I say is like the best practice is something because you can reflect back and say, yeah, that worked really well for us, right? So you only know it when you're reflecting back, and practices need to change. So there might be good practices, there might be useful practices, but kind of honing in on like one practice and like kind of sticking with that and assuming like, well, everybody else is doing it this way. This is what the industry standard is, so we should do it. So with any practice, you can use it well or poorly. And so when I say practices in this context, I mean things like, SMART goals is something I'll hear a lot, like specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, time related, depending on how you define SMART goals. There's a little bit of debate on what I think what the A stands for, or OKRs, so objectives and key results. So if you're using OKRs, take a look at your objectives and ask yourself, is this customer outcome focused? Okay. So again, EBM is actually it's a framework and it's very compatible with different practices you're using. And it might actually help you think about those practices and how you use them more effectively. So practices can be helpful. I'm not against them, but it depends on context and how effectively we utilize our goals is really what matters, right? Or using the practices to create, but not just create them, right? But to inspect and adapt them, to clarify them. And so the idea here is, do you inspect and adapt, right? Or does the organization lock everything in place and expect everyone to just perfectly plan, all right? And so when I coach my clients on effective goals, I like to offer multiple ways to look at goals and encourage them not to just pick one approach or one template, right? Like you have to do what feels right in your context. And you don't want to be too rigid and even dictate like a singular process throughout a large dynamic organization. That might not make sense to different divisions, different departments, different teams. And at the end of the day, goal alignment happens through conversation and creating shared understanding, not just once a year, but frequently enough for your changing context. Okay. All right. So those are our 4 mistakes. So just to summarize, I should have a summary slide here, but I don't. I'll do that next time. Mistake number 1, goals are not focused on customer outcomes. Mistake number 2, we don't measure what matters. Mistake number 3, we don't inspect and adapt goals frequently enough or at all. And mistake number 4, we focus too much on the practices for creating and aligning goals and are rigid about that. So now you're probably thinking, oh, I've got these goals written down and maybe I'm kind of noticing some themes or patterns here, right? And maybe you're kind of also feeling like, oh, now I understand like why I'm a little stressed about this, right? That's a good thing, right? Awareness. So now I do want to share some tips for how we can fix our goals, or that word fix is probably a little misleading because we don't always have full control. And a lot of times these are things we're creating with others. So how can we improve, influence, right? Our goals to be more useful, more effective for us. All right. So tip number 1, ask questions that get to the why until you really can hone in on that real objective, like the customer outcome, if we can get there, right? That's what we're aiming for. And the question could be, why is this important? Another way to tackle it is, why do our customers care about that? Or which of our customers care the most about that? Or what will that enable for our customers, right? So like there's a lot of different ways this question can be explored, and the context of your situation will help you get creative about that. But questions like these can really open up the conversation in helpful ways that create shared understanding. And even if, like you don't influence somebody and like, let's change the goal, at least now we understand the why of the goal, and maybe that'll still help us move in a better direction. And then when we encounter change or we encounter new information, right, we can come back to that and say, hey, wait, like what's changed here, right? So an example I'll share with you here is, so like if we had a goal, which some people might have this goal a couple years ago, make virtual training available for all courses by the end of the year. All right. So, okay, like I can see value in that. It's not necessarily a bad goal, but when we ask ourselves why that's important, maybe we get to something like enable people to learn from wherever they are, whenever they need it. And this actually helps us hone in more on the customer experience of the solution. And if we make virtual training available, but it's not really able to achieve the learning objectives, right? We just kind of flip a switch. Well, that's going to become a problem. And being more clear on the why helps us make decisions along the way about what value we create and how we create it. Right? Tip number 2, do not let the measure become the goal. So for example, an organization sets a goal to increase the number of new customers by 30%. Well, for starters, that's a bit vague. It doesn't give us much clarity in turn that's going to create alignment, because there's probably many things we could do to try to move that number. And there are likely things we could do that might hit that number in the short term, but create a longer term issue. Like if we get a bunch of people in for a trial who aren't the right fit at all, that will mostly cancel by the end of a trial. Okay. And even if we do have a goal, like an actual customer outcome focused goal, sometimes there's this emphasis on hitting a target measure related to the goal, right? And then that emphasis on, well, we've got to hit this measure sort of becomes the goal, right? And so we actually start to lose sight of the why and just start focusing on, well, I've got to hit that target. And that's where you might see like people's bonuses or things like that are tied to measures like that. And that's a definite pattern that will often make the measure suddenly becomes the goal. So remember, what we measure and how we use those measures will influence behaviors, especially if those measures are incentivized. Okay. All right. Tip number 3, let go of control. All right. This is the hard one. On the surface, it sounds easy, but to me, it's the hard one. We have to frequently remind ourselves and help each other remember that we cannot control outcomes and we cannot predict the future. As a Scrum Master, I literally teach people about complexity and unpredictability and how we cannot perfectly plan, nor can we control the many variables that impact us. You likely do this too. And yet, we often find ourselves falling into the trap, desiring control, needing to know, needing to get it right. So have some empathy for yourself and others. I think this is a normal thing for us to kind of fall into this trap. And it is an ongoing journey in my experience. It's a daily practice. So kind of whatever helps you have that like reminder to yourself of like, how do we let go of control? And also helping each other with that, right? Helping your team members, helping your colleagues, helping your friends. All right, next up, tip 4, clarify assumptions. So this can help us see what we need to validate or learn as we move towards a goal. And that, of course, makes us more open to inspecting and adapting the goal frequently enough. This is especially helpful when we have output-focused goals, because we're assuming a certain solution is the right or the best solution. So you can start to get curious and help clarify, well, what are the assumptions behind this? So for example, we might start with a goal to create a mobile app for our product, and that's an output-focused goal. Well, there will likely be a lot of differences in what we build and how we build it if we clarify assumptions. Who do we think will use a mobile app? What value propositions are we assuming a mobile app will provide, and to which of our customers? Clarifying assumptions not only helps us hone in on what to build, but it also reminds us of what we might want to test out, right? Testing out those assumptions sooner rather than later, right? And then that helps us remember, like, okay, instead of just focusing on delivering a mobile app, right? Like, we're not 100% sure exactly what that app needs to look like to deliver value. So what are some experiments we can run? Okay. So maybe we think that mobile app is going to attract a new market, right? Like digital nomads, something like that, right? Completely new market. Well, then we could ask ourselves, okay, that's what the assumption is, that why we have this goal. Well, what's the smallest thing we could build that would help us validate that assumption? And then we can have sort of these like an interim goal that may be on the path to a larger customer outcome focused goal as well. Okay. All right. Tip number 5. Look for goals that create conflict between different teams and departments in your organization. This often happens, this kind of departments or teams kind of almost working against each other and like basically not being in alignment. This happens because we lack a customer outcome focused goal at a higher level, right? That's what actually helps us create alignment in an organization. So for example, an infrastructure group may have a goal related to how quickly they can turn around internal customer requests. By the way, this is also where the measure becomes the goal. And this causes them to create an intake process that requires every single detail to be documented before the request can be submitted. And so you've got product delivery teams that are trying to be flexible and responsive to customer needs and to build iteratively and incrementally, but they run into issues when the infrastructure team doesn't want to have in progress work requests for too long. So they push back and require a lot of documentation and analysis upfront before they will assign the work to anyone, right, to kind of help that product team design a solution and even implementing it iteratively and incrementally. Yeah. All right. So tip number 6, I think we're at 6. All right. Ask when we will come back and revisit to look at our progress. What has changed in our environment? Decide if the goal still makes sense and clarify it based on what we've learned, right? So when we're in conversations and goals are being set, ask the question. So when are we going to come back and make sure that this is still the right thing to focus on? When are we going to come back and clarify our learning? When are we going to come back, right, and incorporate, new information and understand our progress, right? Like all of those types of questions just kind of prompt people to actually be like, yeah, I guess we should come back and look at this, right? It kind of sounds like common sense. We just have to kind of point it out and ask those questions. And if we can establish, a more formal cadence to inspect and adapt goals, and that will happen at different levels of the organization, right? Maybe higher level goals get inspected less frequently than, like a Scrum team, is inspecting every sprint. So you may have this big, hairy, audacious goal in your life or in an organization that's going to maybe take a year or a few years to achieve. Right. And so different levels or timeframes of goals will have a different cadence that makes sense for inspecting and adapting. So just if you're wondering like, what's the right cadence? It's like, use your gut, right? Start somewhere and then inspect and adapt. Your process for inspecting and adapting goals can change, right? Ask yourself, is it frequent enough? Does this feel too frequent that it's creating waste, right? And so you're kind of finding that just right zone. All right, so next up, last tip number 7. Stop treating goal achievement as the sign of success or as a measure of worthiness. It's just a thing that happened or didn't happen. To me, the measure of success is how well we used our goals. Did we frequently inspect our progress towards them? And how well did we adapt based on what we were learning and what was changing in our environment around us? Did we clarify our goals as we learned more? Did we change our goals when it became apparent that we needed to pivot? To me, that is how I look at success. Did we do the best we could, leveraging empiricism and an agile mindset, right? Transparent information, staying open and curious to navigate complexity and unpredictability. And my worthiness has nothing to do with what I do or don't do, what I achieve or don't achieve. And we all need to remember that so that we can leverage goals effectively in all aspects of life, our teams at work, organizations as well. So it can feel overwhelming to change how an organization uses goals, but you can influence this by simply asking questions that help people have better conversations about what really matters. And even if everything doesn't change overnight, be persistent and trust that you are creating an impact. You are creating transparency to the situation. You're showing people a different perspective, right? You're sort of bringing reality into the room when we're kind of falling back into that. We can control it, right? We can plan it, right? Yeah, so start putting these tips into practice where you can, in your personal life, maybe a community organization you're part of, and with your Agile team. And look for those opportunities to help leaders in your organization be more open and curious about possibilities when it comes to using goals effectively. And if you're ready to go deeper, I do invite you to join my one-day PAL EBM live virtual training on May 13th. EBM focuses on customer value and intentional experimentation to systematically improve an organization's performance and achieve their strategic goals. It is complementary to Scrum, but can also be useful no matter what Agile process the teams are using. And EBM is also flexible in that it can be applied at the team level, or, and I do believe you get greater benefits here, in higher levels of the organization, like a division, or maybe like across, a product suite area, or the entire organization even, because it helps create greater alignment. And so I'm offering a 15% discount to Scrum Masters of the Universe when you sign up by April 22nd. So definitely a good bit of time there to kind of clear schedules and get that aligned if this is speaking to you. And of course, you can read the evidence-based management guide that's free on scrum.org's website. So I will also, let me drop in the chat for you, because I'm realizing that might be helpful, a link to the registration page for the class and the coupon code Scrum Master 15 if you want to sign up. All right, so I hope that I do get to work deeper with some of you in class on May 13th. And I would love to be able to get some feedback too right now before we go into the Q&A round. I'm curious what you're taking away right now. Like, what are your ahas that you're having, your insights that you're having? Because I know we've got a lot of amazing experienced people on this call, a lot of great different perspectives. So let's take a minute and just drop in the chat, what's the takeaway you have? What's that aha moment, or the thing you're going to do based on this, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So let's tap the wisdom of the group first. Revise goals based on experience. Yeah. Most people don't inspect and adapt their goals. Yep. Yeah. Changing goal. I know my mind was blown too. The first time I was like, how did I not really think about that before? Yeah. Meeting goals doesn't have to be how we measure our success. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Don't make goals.
Yeah, you said it better than I wrote it.
Yeah, awesome. They should provide a direction and trigger the right behavior. Yeah, and that's a tricky thing to navigate. And that's another reason we need to be looking at how well are we using goals? Is this creating unintended consequences, right? And how we're doing it, because we're dealing with human beings, right? This isn't like some process where it's like, if I do this and follow these steps, the humans will act accordingly, right? Like I wish it worked that way. It just doesn't. Yeah, the asking why, and so many different ways we can ask that why question. So, just dig in, ask in a number of different ways to explore and try to like really get to like, but what are we doing this for? Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you guys for sharing all this. Yeah. Evolve them as we move along. Yeah. Ask. Yeah. The 5 whys. I mean, it's a real thing. Yeah.
So
All
we did
right.
have a couple questions in chat. Are you ready for some of those?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, so let's go ahead and move into the Q&A. And I actually want to tackle the question I just saw come up, because as a professional Scrum trainer, I have like this, like I could have like gone super deep into certain things, but like the question's there, so I want to answer it. You do not change your sprint goal. Okay. So that's a Scrum rule for a reason. And so, but you have different goals and different time horizons. Okay. So the reason the sprint goal doesn't change is because if we changed it, we would never get anything meaningful done in a sprint, right? We're talking about a really short time box. And so that sprint goal not changing is what provides us enough focus. And it also gives us flexibility in terms of how we meet the goal. But it's that idea that like, if we just changed it every day, we'd have a whole bunch of work in progress and we'd never get anything done. So focus, bringing in that Scrum value, the sprint goal does not change. Now, we might fail to meet it. And this is what I really emphasize in my teaching and my coaching is, it doesn't mean you're a bad team because you didn't meet your sprint goal. And I would actually argue that the number one thing is, do you have a done increment? Do you have a useful increment of value, right? Like that's probably towards your sprint goal, even if you didn't quite meet the sprint goal. And that's information we can inspect, right? Like what happened? Was that goal too vague? Was that goal just kind of too audacious, right? And like we learn from it. So I don't look at like, do we meet our sprint goals as like the be all end all either? Like, does it matter? Is it part of the conversation? Sure. So that's kind of where this ties in, is it's like that goal doesn't change and there's very good reasons for that. But also what it ties into the whole, like your worthiness, your success isn't just tied to whether you meet a goal or not, right? Because again, if that's the perception of like, you're not a good team if you don't always meet your sprint goal, that can lead to unintended consequences. Yeah. So I saw that question and I was like, oh, I got to dig in, because that's like a really helpful thing to help us understand time horizons of goals matter, and like the bigger context as well.
so what are some of those unintended consequences that would happen if a team's success was based on how many times that team met their sprint goals?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the biggest one is we're going to say we met the sprint goal, even if we maybe were close to it and didn't.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing around like, velocity. It's like, well, let's just say we earned those points, right? Whenever I hear something like that, it's like, oh, the team thinks their effectiveness, their productivity is like based on a number for, throughput or velocity, whatever
that
way
just
we're tracking
accumulates
that.
technical debt.
Exactly. Right. So like that's another great example too, of like, we might still have the done increment and have met the sprint goal, but we might make choices like that will accumulate technical debt, and not for the good reasons to accumulate technical debt, like the intentional business value reasons that we make to accumulate technical debt. And we're also less likely to be transparent about that technical debt too. Yeah. We also could have burnout, right? Like people just being like, we got to do it, and, that burns people out as well. And that of course has a lot of unintended consequences, especially if it's a pattern and it continues, right? That can lead to low morale, that can lead to quality issues, right? Because we're burnt out, we're going to make mistakes. And ultimately, people could leave, right? If they don't like to work in that environment. Yeah. Like that other one. Yeah. The team might just start setting the goals to be like really simple or things they can control better. And so especially like trying to stay away from customer outcome focused goals because they're less controllable. Yeah. Absolutely. I saw another question about goal achievement being the primary measure for performance reviews, and my thoughts on this. So I like, full disclosure, like I have not like worked at like high levels of companies where like I had to set policies and make these choices. Like I've been influenced by those things. I've been affected by those things. I understand the theory and concepts, and, like I understand the dynamics of it, but I haven't been in that position of like truly influencing how HR is running the company and things like that, or and how managers, but I do feel very strongly that if that is the primary focus, right? Not saying it can't be part of the conversation, but if it becomes like a math formula, that's where I think, we are oversimplifying, conversations like, where do I want to go in my career? How do I want to show up at work? What skills do I want to grow? How am I being a good team member? Right? Like there's so many dynamics that go into play in terms of like performance, and like how we navigate compensation and promotions. And so I think that it's definitely it definitely gets a little dicey, and you have the unintended behaviors, the unintended consequences, if you are overemphasizing achievement of goals, and especially if those goals are fixed, right? Like to me, that's completely ridiculous. And so I think it's worth kind of challenging that in our company. We're sitting down to say like, hey, we're setting your goals for the year. And I mean, I've done that. And, I look back on it now and it's like, that's interesting. I said I would achieve this certification, but like, what if things changed in my life and something else became more important to me? Is that not okay? Like, or even, in the company, something was happening and I realized, oh, it's actually better for me to shift my focus here, both for the team, but I'm also interested in this. Like, is that going to be a problem now on my annual performance review? So yeah, I think we have to be really cautious about that and not make it like a math formula or too much of the emphasis. It's maybe a factor in a conversation, but if we're fixing those goals and they're unchangeable, then I think that's definitely going to create some of those issues. And also even just like you feel like crap because you feel set up for failure at some point. If you realize like, well, this isn't even achievable or this doesn't even make sense anymore, it's like, well, what do you do? Yeah. All right. So what other questions do we have? Setting customer-centric goals on component teams. Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah. So, I mean, their context matters. Like we don't have a ton of time to dig too deep into the context, but what I'll say, because I know that others might be struggling with this in their own context. So when we say component teams, my assumption is we're talking more about like specialized teams where versus like feature teams where like they can cut through the whole application stack, right? And there are times that like I can see component and feature teams like collaborate and work well together. So, like I know it's challenging. I've seen a few circumstances where, this can work. And the idea is there needs to be like these aligning goals at higher levels that cross teams, right? If that component team, and I'm assuming they are, is essential to other teams being successful in delivering customer value, then we need to think about aligning at a customer outcome type of goal. And again, like I think the people involved in doing the work need to be part of setting the goal, right? Like none of this should be done in a vacuum, because we need everybody to understand it. And like people can ask really helpful clarifying questions, as we're trying to better understand a goal, as we're inspecting our progress towards it, as we're refining it. So I think you do need to involve the teams that are impacted and also helping set and revise goals. But yeah, like that's why you got to find that higher level goal that's going to help create alignment around a customer outcome. Yeah. Does that help? I hope so.
Stephanie, may I ask? I'm interested in one of the questions that just came up on the chat window about internal customers. Is there a kind of like a pathway we go to for perhaps some of the areas where we're crafting goals, where they don't understand external customer outcomes, so that we have to kind of like take them through a learning journey too. And maybe there's a transition that we go through, so we give them somewhere that's sort of a transition through a pathway to something else before we get to customer value. So we have to be gentle and patient with these teams.
Sure. Like, yeah, like the situation, it kind of sounds like what you're describing. If it makes sense, right? Like to start helping people begin to understand those customer outcomes, taking them on that journey. Absolutely. And I think a lot of those why questions, like kind of digging into like, well, why are we doing that? Is helpful. I would also say like, you know, it's okay too, to like have goals that are internal customer outcome focused too sometimes, right? Like, I'm not going to say like, it's always got to be like that end external customer, but painting that picture, right, of like, why does serving our internal customers actually help our external customers? I think that's a helpful picture to paint, like you're describing. But even things like, you know, if like an accounting department, right? Like that handles like financials and, or, you know, the payroll team, right? The people who support the tools related to payroll and benefits, you know, instead of just talking about like, we're delivering this feature, we're implementing this policy, it's like, what are we trying to enable for our employees? Right? Like that's a way you're still talking about the internal customer, but you're trying to create an outcome for them. So I would say like, it doesn't always have to be like that external customer. I think there's some valid, you know, outcomes that matter to your internal people, right? Depending on the type of product you have. So like, yes to everything you said. And I'm always about like meeting people where they are, but also challenging, right? And like calling them forward. And we can do that by painting that picture of the impact we're creating. But also there are times I think that understanding an internal customer's outcome is very useful and valuable as well. Does that help?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Great.
So I think we are just about time. We might have time for maybe one more quick question. Do you have a quick one? Maybe there was one on the difference between aspirational and inspirational. Maybe you want to explain the difference really quickly on those again?
I have no idea. I don't know. Like, you know, those words can mean the same thing or different things. I don't know. But I think I might,
yeah.
I have an opinion based on how I'm going to interpret the question, if that may be helpful.
Sure.
How I'm interpreting the question is, and this is because I'll hear it sometimes, like, we want to have like a stretch goal. I'll hear things like, and a stretch goal. And it's like, why do we feel a need to have a stretch goal? You know, like, is it because we think the team isn't going to do more work if they complete the goal early? Like why do we feel a need to have a stretch goal? You know, in terms of like goals being, so this kind of comes back to SMART goals. You know, sometimes like, it's like, is it achievable? Or like this idea of like, is it aspirational? You know, if you're like a startup company and like your big goal, like that's probably going to take you like years to achieve and you're disrupting and creating innovation, like if it might be an aspirational goal because you're not even completely sure you can do it, but you have this like big goal you're aiming towards, and that might make sense in that context. You know, but like as you move to like smaller time horizons, like less long time horizons, you know, like I don't know how it depends. Like, is it okay to to me, like if you have an aspirational goal and you find it's not something you're going to be able to achieve and you need to pivot, as long as you're inspecting and adapting, that's great. But if you have like this aspirational goal that is a little bit like out there and you know, you're not sure you're going to be able to achieve it, and you don't inspect and adapt and you don't clarify and you don't pivot, then that's, I think, where it might become a problem. So I don't know if like my interpretation of that was on point, but hopefully that helps.
It helps. Well, Stephanie, I want to thank you so much. I want to respect your time and the time box for this meeting. So we so appreciate you coming. And I will say to the rest of you, in terms of the EBM course that Stephanie offers, I have to put my own plug in, and she did not ask me to say this, but I took this class with her, and it was was amazing, and I was able to apply a lot of what I learned from that class. That, a lot of it's still in the works, but we've set some foundational groundwork in using evidence-based management within my own teams. And so, that I would just highly recommend, if you have the time and the space to take that course from Stephanie. It's well worth it. So that's my little plug. She didn't tell me or pay me. It's just but thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you all for coming today. It's always good to see you at Scrum Masters of the Universe, and we can't wait to see you again next time. All right, thanks everyone.